Welcome to the Coaching Corner, a podcast for coaches in the child welfare field. On today's episode, we'll be talking about independence mapping with Danica Perez. We'll cover how to adapt the safety mapping structure from safety organized practice to the needs of transition age youth preparing for independence. I'm your host, Bill James, and we'll be right back. With me today is Danica Perez. Hi, Danica.
Hi, good morning.
So glad you could join us and talk about independence mapping and how it's making a difference for the older foster youth that you've worked with in the last few years.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. So tell us a little bit about your work with extended foster youth over the last couple of years.
My work with the extended foster care teens have been that we were assisting them in transitioning them to their independence. We help them with such things as housing, education, looking for work, and any other types of resources that they've needed. For example, we've had pregnant teens that may need support. So along the way, we would just help them reach their goals and transition them to whatever goals they wanted.
Gotcha. And so a few years ago, San Diego County embarked on rolling out safety organized practice. And of course, safety organized practice has that process called safety mapping. And tell us a little bit about how you adapted that to better work with this population.
Absolutely. I was really encouraged by safety organized practice. It helped me as a continuing worker, and I was a part of the safety organized practice by being an early adopter. So when I transferred positions to extended foster care, I didn't think that safety organized practice applied because we were more focused on discussing independence as opposed to our focus being on the safety of the youth. So what we did was just change the terms and definitions that we use and made it applicable to extended foster care. The structure of what's working well and what are we concerned about, and ultimately the action plan we can apply to anything where we're discussing how to reach someone's goal. So I just felt that it could be tweaked and changed, and that's what we did. We changed the definitions.
Yeah, so I can see how the focus on reunification might not have fit as well for the extended foster care kids, and yet it sounds like the structure of that of those three questions still turned out that it could be applied effectively.
Absolutely.
So, Danica, we have some visual aids from a presentation I think that you and Jenny Ossing helped put together a while ago. So, let's go through some of those slides. Tell us a little bit from your perspective, what is independence mapping?
Independence mapping is essentially using the same structure as the safety mapping. However, what we do is we're trying to assist the youth in organizing and thinking about and bringing clarity to the goals they want to achieve. Any barriers that make achieving the goal challenging, we want to discuss those by talking about what they're worried about and what the team is worried about. Um, the next steps that are needed for the youth to achieve those goals. We discussed that in the action plan. And ultimately, we want to make sure that we're also talking about the permanent connections and supports that they have. And hopefully, they're all in the room. But if not, we just can discuss how they play a role in supporting them accomplish their goals and how they can reach out to them long after they're out of extended foster care.
Super. So, like a regular safety mapping, I'm guessing that you get started with group agreements.
Yes. We do. I think it's important, it's essential to have an effective flow of the room and that the youth feel safe. that they're able to feel comfortable in the room about discussing any issues that come up, and that we have boundaries set for everyone in the room, where we talk about everyone should be heard. Everybody's there to discuss the youth and his or her progress, and we can agree to disagree respectfully. We want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to talk. We want to stay away from judgments, labels, as well as work from the assumption that everyone in the room wants what's in this youth's best interest.
Yeah.
But we don't stop there. We also, that's just to set the tone and the foundation, but then we also refer to the youth and see what agreements he or she would like to add to their safety or their independence mapping.
And I'm guessing that it's important, especially with teenagers who have been working with people, professionals and CASAs and stuff like that for quite a while. It's probably important to try to keep a future focus to a large extent, rather than rehashing things that maybe the youth has made difficult for people in the past.
Absolutely. I think that it's really essential that the youth's voice be heard in the meeting. I think that instead of coming from the approach of everyone in the team that's in the meeting telling the youth what they should do, it's more important to hear the voice of the youth telling us what they would like to do, because what we know is that are more likely to accomplish their goals if it's coming from them rather than other people telling them what to do.
So it sounds like that part of the group agreements is really important to make sure that the youth voice is front and center.
Absolutely.
Okay. Tell us, in what kinds of situations would an eco map be useful to start with in an independence mapping?
Eco map is not necessarily always done because it just depends on what age we are uh, doing the mapping. Ideally, we'd like to do it at every mapping. However, I leave that up to the facilitator and the social worker to determine if the mapping needs to have permanent connections discussed. Um, but it is important to talk about those permanent connections in such cases as when a youth doesn't have any, and they're saying they don't know who to reach out to. So it's really important at that point. And for them to also explore more, because a lot of times they'll come in with two or three, and we'll do an eco map and they'll come out with, six or seven. And so it depends on the discussion, it depends on the barriers and challenges for the youth, and if permanent connections is one of those, then we'll definitely incorporate an eco map.
So then you move on from the kind of building the network using the eco map to essentially the same three questions. You want to go over
Correct.
those?
Sure. We really have used the same exact structure of getting to the details of what's going on in a mapping for the youth. We start off with what's working well. And we start off with that because what we've learned is that if we start off with a youth and discussing what are they worried about, a lot of times we're going into more of the negative, and our youth will shut down.
Hmm.
Discussing what's working well is where you begin to see them sort of talk about the things that have made them proud and their accomplishments. The team also discusses what has made them proud about the youth. And you begin to see them sort of light up and build confidence. And a lot of times they don't even realize that they've done as many things as they have. Um, and so those accomplishments we start talking about, because we want them to see how much they've already achieved. And then, it helps us to then guide them into where they could do more or where they can go next.
Right.
Um,
And
so
like so many clients, really, from a solution-focused interviewing perspective, starting with exception questions and looking for where things are working well is almost always a better conversation starter.
absolutely. And I think, the focused questions are essential in terms of the three questions, because you don't want to feed them or guide them or lead them into what we'd like for them to say. We, sort of turn on the light bulb and help them process and ask them, what's the best day in your life look like? Or what kind of job do you want them to have? Would you like to have? Um, and asking those types of questions gets them thinking as they've never thought before. And the answers that they come up with are sometimes, oh, I've never thought about that like that,
Yeah.
or I've never really, you know, asked, no one's ever asked me that before. And so it gives us a lot more meat and potatoes to sort of work with, to help guide them towards their goals. Also, in terms of working with the question, what are we worried about? Um, it's important that we set the tone to say, what are we worried about, as opposed to any other question, because it broadens the range in which not only the youth will have a discussion with what their concerns are, but the team as well. Because I think it's important not to narrow it just to specific extended foster care goals where we just kind of tailor it to, housing and employment. We want to open it up because we want to talk about if they're worried about things like substance abuse, their mental health. We want to broaden that question and not narrow that question, because sometimes the things that they come up with in terms of a discussion, we actually want to address because it could be an issue that impedes their ability to reach their goal that we never thought about before, or they never thought about.
Gotcha.
So we keep that question broad. Then we move on into the next steps, their action plan. So basically, by discussing what they've already accomplished and what are they worried about, we can come up with a really concise action plan of how do we keep going with what they're already doing well and expand on those things, as well as help them eliminate some of the barriers that are in their way from accomplishing those goals. So those two very structured sections and questions
Hmm.
allow for us to discuss the ultimate action plan. We always want to make sure that we are addressing specifically housing, employment, any independent living skills that they want to address, like if they want to start learning how to drive, and employment, because we want to make sure we, for extended foster care purposes, that we are addressing those specific goals, but we will go into any other goals they'd like to accomplish as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're already starting to talk about things that they're already doing, and then you have a specific. Seems like you have a specific definition for independence, sort of in place of safety, and you differentiate between actions moving towards independence versus strengths. What's Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So we wanted to make sure we were modeling safety organized practice as much and as closely as possible. And so we're really talking about um, independence and not safety. So I wanted to ensure that for the purposes of the mapping and everyone involved in it, that they understood what we were discussing. And independences are just actions of enrichment taken by the youth with the support of their permanent connections and support network to work towards education, employment, healthy relationships, stable housing, and or a healthy physical or behavioral needs that are demonstrated over time. Um,
So
and
a little more focused than
yes,
just what's. I mean, there's what's working well, and then you've got it split up into
absolutely. And
these
so then
categories.
we narrow it down to discuss the difference between what an actual independent action is and overall general strengths of the youth. So the actions are things that are demonstrated actions over or behavior, excuse me, by the youth that could be used to create independence.
Okay.
So or the youth may in the what's working well section discuss things that they've done that aren't necessarily actions of independence, but they're just things that they have skills, independent skills or living qualities that are important, but not directly addressing barriers to independence.
Right, right. So if they did well in sports or band, or maybe they're a crackerjack video game player, those
Right.
things might be strengths, but they're not necessarily going to contribute that much to independence.
Absolutely. Or they could be just, in terms of their social skills or in terms of just, having an awesome personality.
Right.
We can discuss how that piece is a great skill, not necessarily an independent skill, but we will discuss in the mapping how those particular skills can help them with their independence. Having a great personality and being funny may help them in terms of just landing a job, but just knowing how to use those two skills appropriately and wanting to help guide them with those skills is essential.
So then you've done some differentiation in the what are we worried about piece. What does that look like?
Absolutely. We also had to make sure that we were clear about discussing some of the barriers. And so we broke it down into internal barriers, external, and differentiating that for the youth and for the social worker in terms of what the two barriers are versus a complicating factor. And so, an internal barrier is actions or behaviors taken or controlled by the youth that have gotten in the way of them achieving independence. And the key word there is that something that they can control. External barriers are actions and circumstances or behaviors of others outside of the youth's control that have gotten in the youth's way of achieving their independence.
That's such an important distinction to make, and I really uh, can see some important insights coming out of making that distinction, because so many of our youth do face systemic barriers,
Mm-hmm.
uh, socioeconomic barriers that are not their making,
Yeah.
and so to help call that out just seems like that could help with the problem solving in a number of ways. So, what are some examples then of complicating factors?
Some examples of complicating factors are things that we are worried about. They could be anything that may aggravate their situation, but they're not really anything that affects their ability to achieve independence.
Gotcha.
For example, their distance to school, it might be something that we're worried about, but it won't prohibit them from getting, to and from school, or their relationship with their mother. May aggravate the situation if it's, a tumultuous relationship, but it doesn't prohibit them from achieving their goal.
Right. Yeah, so I can imagine maybe a youth who says they want to get into the military or be a police officer. Marijuana use would probably be an important internal barrier because they're making that choice and they have control over it. If
Exactly.
if they've got themselves lined up for a job in a tattoo parlor or a medical marijuana dispensary, whether or not they're using marijuana today or not could be something, especially that the grown-ups are worried about, but that might not actually stop them from accomplishing those goals.
Exactly. Absolutely.
And I bet that's hard for some of the grown-ups to hear sometimes.
It is, and I have experienced in mappings where we have to be specific about the differences because it's more worrisome to them and they feel that they won't accomplish their goals because they're smoking marijuana. And I think being clear with the definition and being clear with how it may or may not impact them is really important to moving forward with the team's impression of how we're going to get towards their goal.
Yeah, I'm sure that can be quite a challenge. I heard you say earlier that you use this independence scale to sort of get a read on where people are at the beginning of the mapping. How do you use it near the end of the mapping process?
Well, essentially, what we do is in the beginning, we scale the youth's perception of their own independence. And so 9 times out of 10 we'll get a youth's score on the lower end, more dependent than independent, and it may range anywhere from 0 to 4. Some youth are quite confident and will get the higher end, and they feel like they're more 7 or 8. um, However, it also depends on when we're mapping. So sometimes we're mapping a 17-year-old, and so, of course, they're leaning more towards the lower end of the scale. If we're mapping a 20-and-a-half-year-old, they're, of course, they should be at a higher end of the scale. But it just depends. And so we work from there to sort of get an understanding of where they feel they are. Now, the second time we do the independent scale is sort of after we've answered the 3 questions and developed the action plan. Towards the end, we ask them again, now that you have your action plan in front of you, how do you feel? Once this is accomplished, how would you feel your independence level will be? And they always say a 9. I've never gotten an 8, or it consistently has been a 9. And I
Really,
Yeah,
it always makes them feel more optimistic and hopeful about the future.
absolutely. And I always follow up that question with, why not a 10? What would take you from a 9 to a 10? After viewing your action plan, and almost consistently I get the same answer of, I'd like to see it play out. If I actually follow through with these steps and everything works out, of course then I'm going to feel like a 10. But right now we're just looking at it, and I'm just feeling great about the layout of the plan, but they want to see it come to fruition.
It's like they feel really good about the structured conversation, and they feel like they have a lot more clarity about what needs to happen. And
Hmm.
really, appropriately, like any grown up, they kind of need to see it to believe it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Very cool. Okay, so I can see how that's a really powerful adaptation of the safety mapping process for older youth and extended foster care youth. So you've done a bunch of these over the last couple of years. What have been some of the challenges and rough spots that social workers might anticipate as they go out and try this with some of their youth?
Sure. One of the things that I've noticed is that it's really important to try to pull together as many team members and support network people as possible in the room. Community providers, family members, friends, anybody that the youth wants, but essentially, the bigger the team, the better. What I've noticed is that if it's just the youth and the social worker, it works. You can accomplish a thorough mapping. However, I think it's really important for the youth to really see and hear from other people and how they feel about them in terms of what's working well and some of the worries. It really helps broaden their perspective about, um, their world, and what other people, think and feel about their life, and how they can reach accomplishing their goals. So that's important. Really trying to establish a team as much as possible.
Um,
Um,
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I notice about that statement is it really relates back in some ways to the KDA core practice model and the
mhm,
idea that there really is value in diversity of thought and diversity of perspective in terms of a youth's well-being and well-being and permanency.
sure. Sure, absolutely. And I think it's important that we're working from transparency as well. I mean, as a social worker, when we're working with the youth, one of the things, or any client actually, is to have transparency about how the agency feels they're doing and what they could be doing better. And so it's great to have the social worker in the room, but there should also be transparency among the family members and the friends, and it gives them the opportunity to really, get their perspective, and any of the community providers, such as the therapists and that kind of thing. It's great to have those perspectives.
Super. Um, So, what other advice would you have for social workers and people that care about these youth? What other advice would you have for them in trying to make this work for their kids?
Sure. I think one of the other challenges, and the one more important ones that I've experienced, is making sure that if there's a youth with special needs and or mental health, that we ensure that we're doing the mapping in an appropriate way. And what I mean by that is making sure that they have the capacity to sit in the mapping. I don't think the mapping is necessarily for every youth. I think that has to be the assessment of not just the social worker, but the team. Um, and I've had a situation where I did have a youth that was diagnosed with bipolar. I didn't know going into the mapping. So I think it's really essential to make sure that the facilitator is aware of such barriers. But her capacity to finish the mapping wasn't there. We weren't able to get all the way through because there were certain triggers that I was not aware of as a facilitator that when they came up, unfortunately, we had to stop the mapping. We did not conclude all the way through to her action plan because she was becoming volatile and upset. And I think that the social worker needs to understand that we have to appropriately accommodate and do what we can to adjust for the teenager based on their ability to follow through or adhere to certain guidelines and boundaries of the meeting, or just to be able to understand some of the language. Things like that should be thought about.
So it sounds like it isn't exactly a one size fits all for all youth, and that coordination between the social worker and if they're going to use an outside facilitator, like a TDM facilitator or a child and family team facilitator, that there needs to be some communication in advance so that the child's needs are clear.
Absolutely. It's just like anytime we place a child in a home, we offer the dangerous propensity so that the caregiver's aware, same for the facilitator. We need to be aware. Are there certain restrictions that need to be followed, or in terms of court orders? Maybe we can't have certain people in the room. Maybe there are issues where the youth just might be set off.
Yeah,
And so the facilitator should be aware not to touch certain hot buttons.
yeah. And out of 100 independence mappings, how often is there something that just torpedoes the process?
Not very many, but you know, some have actually surprised me. We actually mapped for a youth that had Asperger's, and he was able to follow through. We came up with a pretty good action plan with the help of the team, and so what we adjusted for was that the mapping ultimately ended up being more for the team to help him as opposed to him coming up with his own goals and accomplishments. He was able to discuss some of the goals that he wanted to accomplish, but the team was able to get some support around how are we going to help get him there.
So that's one of those situations where differentiating between internal barriers and external barriers was crucial for the kind of next steps that needed to happen.
Exactly,
Very-
exactly. And that's the great thing about the mapping is it can allow for such adjustments. And the reason behind being really clear about the internal external barriers is essential, just based on the fact that we want to make sure the youth also understands what that is, because it helps them to understand too what are they in control of and can change, and what they can't change. How do we help them get around and navigate through those barriers?
Gotcha. Let me ask you this: any parting thoughts for the social work audience and coaching audience that you'd like to summarize for them for this independence mapping?
Sure, absolutely. What I found in its development and use, and facilitating a number of them, is that Mappings have been really useful in helping not just the youth but the social worker. It's allowed for clarity on all sides of how do we get this youth to accomplish their goals. It involves their voice, and so that's really critical. And I think that the team, it allows for the team to come together, and it gives us the whole process a purpose, and a guideline. It also alleviates duplication of services, and
Hmm.
that's one of the things that ended up coming up in its impact on meeting with some of the community providers, because there's so many people involved in the youth's life, or should be, that it helps so that if we have a social worker, an ILS worker, and a CASA, we're not all duplicating services. We are individually able to take on a task and assist the youth with that specific task. Um, so the ultimate outcome after the mapping is the youth feels better. The youth feels like they have some clarity. The social worker can also articulate to the court more clearly what the youth wants. So it's helpful to the social worker. So if done regularly and consistently, you can also see some progress. Doing the TILPs in accordance with the mappings is a great purpose, so that the transitional independent living plan is not just something you sit down and sign with the youth and come up with one-on-one as social worker and youth, but you come up with together and with their voice.
Very cool.
Um, and so ultimately, it's been very impactful, very useful, and guiding the youth overall to their ultimate independence.
Well, Danica, we really appreciate you joining us today to go over independence mapping. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Coaching Corner from the Public Child Welfare Training Academy at the Academy for Professional Excellence, a project of the San Diego State University School of Social Work. For more information about the Academy and the services we offer, please visit us on the web at theacademy.sdsu.edu. You can subscribe to our podcast series by searching for The Academy SDSU on YouTube. If you would like to contact us and provide feedback about this podcast, please go to our website and use the Contact Us link at the bottom of the homepage. Please reference the title of this podcast in the subject line. A very special thank you to our guest today, Danica Perez. Please join us next time as we explore more topics in the child welfare arena. I'm your host, Bill James. Until next time, let's all support the hardworking child welfare workers out there to try something new to improve outcomes for kids and families. Thank you for listening.